Andy Dunne, a very good morning.
Good morning.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
This breakdown in relationship isn't just an immediate you went drinking therefore you're out of the squad sort of thing. That's probably the reason why he's out of the squad. But this goes back to that England game last year when you look at some of the comments that's come out and Finn Russell is basically saying you're holding us back. Your style of play is holding us back. We're going to go out and play our way, and we all saw what happened in the second half of that game.
Yeah, to me it's really surprising because I would have thought Finn Russell is a very similar style player to Gregor Townsend was himself as a player. And Townsend got a lot of his success by playing a very exciting brand of rugby with Glasgow initially. He also had experience away from Northern Hemisphere rugby as a player and a coach in Natal at one stage towards the tail end of his playing career. So he's had quite a diverse introduction to coaching himself, and a lot of his teams play a pretty open, flowing brand of rugby. So it seems like a little bit of a contradiction in terms that Russell is saying you're holding us back. However, the second half in Twickenham at 38-7 down and going on and scoring, I think 31 or 31-7 or something, whatever it was. I mean, they scored the best part of 30 odd points, 35 points unanswered in an electric period of play. A lot of it I would suppose veer towards positivity, and in fact was incredibly good Scottish play as opposed to porous English defence in that 40-minute period. And if that type of play was born out of an argument at half time from your lead strategist on field and your head coach, and it's so opposite to how they played in the first half, there's obviously no smoke without fire, so there's something going on there, yeah. Just
like to return to those quotes, if you missed it at the top of the show, what Finn Russell said was, I said, you're telling us to kick, and when we kick, they're just running it back and cut us open, and when we run it, they're hitting us behind the gain line and winning the ball back. Like, that's fairly damning stuff of a coach. To me, that seems like a fairly basic thing to diagnose on the pitch when you're sitting up in the stands.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's never that simple. It's never as binary as that. But it's probably just a clash that's been building up under the surface for a while. I think it happens a lot with senior players. I think very often a player will maybe have that conversation in private in a much more gentle fashion. But obviously Russell's a bit more rock and roll. He's that maverick attitude. You know, there's reports he's gone out drinking and not turned up training. So there's an element of that maverick in him, and he obviously sees it. He doesn't see a huge issue in coming out and criticising his coach in public. I don't think it would ever be done, or certainly hasn't been done much in the last 20, 30 years by an Irish player. So yeah, but I do think it happens, and I think it's fair. It's probably welcomed in a professional squad where people will question things. I've recently heard Stuart Lancaster talk about how they've got very diverse views in their coaching team. A lot of different views from the likes of Robin McBride coming in, Felipe from Argentina, Stuart from England, and Leo from born and bred in Dublin. So very, very diverse views in that, where a couple of years ago they maybe had Leo, John Fogarty and Gervin Dempsey, possibly all from the Irish coaching school of tactics and strategy and technical play. But the diversity they've brought into that Leinster group feeds a little bit of argument, feeds a bit of healthy debate, and I think that's probably important for success. I don't think it's that important to do it spread out across national media after having about 9 pints, or you know, it's slightly different in terms of the delicacy with which Russell has delivered this bombshell.
Is it a situation now where you would be surprised to see Gregor Townsend as head coach of Scotland, say, come the autumn series? Like, there were a lot of questions in the Scottish media after the World Cup performances, because that performance against Ireland, we all know, was shocking from Scotland.
They've been pretty abject. Been a huge disappointment for me and for a lot of people watching them, based on the anticipation we had with Townsend taking over and the style of play he plays. But it's entirely dependent on the results in the next few weeks. I mean, Roy Keane walked out in Saipan, and Mick McCarthy's Irish team played some of the best football they played in years back in 2002. So it does. I mean, it's a cold old profession in that Russell could walk out the door and they might end up playing a little better as a collective unit. He's notoriously unpredictable. That can have huge benefits, but can also have drawbacks when half your team don't know what you're going to do either. So while I am a fan, I think he brightens up the game. He makes rugby fun and interesting to look at. There is an argument that they may be a more settled squad. Townsend gets a greater degree of control over how the team plays overall, and other players respond and step up. And again, I suppose there is history and an example of the likes of the Keenan Saipan issue, where apparently the best and most important player leaves and the team end up playing better. So I would hold judgment on Townsend until we see a couple of results.
Fair enough. It's interesting that you mentioned Leinster there and the different voices that we've seen in the camp over the last couple of years, how it's led to not only great results on the pitch, but also a brand of rugby, which I think most Irish rugby fans wouldn't be disappointed to see tried out with the national team. What's your sense of that? Is there a possibility that we do see this happen with an Ireland team, first of all? But actually, before we get into that, perhaps just explain, in your view, the vast differences that we sometimes see between Leinster and Ireland.
In recent years, I suppose that they weren't entirely dissimilar. About 4 or 5 years ago, at one stage, Schmidt was playing a very open game in Leinster where they used the full width of the field. I think Joe, for reasons unknown, the game plan tightened up and continued to tighten up over time. We ended up seeing an Irish side that would have multiple ball carries, for example, but very little yardage gained in aggregate yardage or metres. So we might get an Irish side that carried 120, 130 times into contact, but the aggregate would be 2 metre, 3 metre carries per player, and we're not making a huge amount of ground. Also playing in a very kind of a narrow usage of the field. So the difference would have been with Leinster under Leo and Lancaster, notably in the last couple of seasons, using the entire width of the field, creating space between defenders, encouraging a bit more offloads out of the tackle. As a result, what you're seeing is less carries per player, more metres gained, probably not holding the possession for as long in periods. So it's a little more risky to play that way, but it's a style that would be quite common now. Japan play that way, New Zealand play that way. So there are probably some of the key differences. I think in reality, Farrell has a very, very similar attacking coaching mindset to Lancaster, and as a result, I think where even the non-Leinster Irish fans, the Munster, Ulster, Connacht fans who might look on with Leinster at times and begrudge them the odd win or success, I think they might look at the style and say, would be nice to see an Irish side play that way. I think that's quite feasible. They're because
that's our idea here, that we just don't have the players. Only the people from Fiji and New Zealand can play like that.
No, I think absolutely. It's not about playing kind of unlimited circus rugby. It's there's got to be a discipline to it. There's got to be a responsibility for players on the ball to make decisions, and the right decisions. But I think players are very much empowered to make decisions without a very, very restrictive or prescriptive style of play from the top level down. So I think it's quite likely we'll see an adoption of that more open style, because Farrell and Lancaster they've worked together in reverse for England. Obviously, Andy Farrell was Stuart's assistant. So I think the likelihood is that there'll probably be a bit more of groupthink going on in a good way from the provinces leading through to the Irish setup. I think what was happening in the latter periods for Schmidt in Ireland was he was very, very I suppose belligerent about how that Irish team were going to continue playing. We didn't evolve after that New Zealand win, and we did poor Six Nations, which we ended up trying to stick with the game plan and do it better and execute it better. Was probably the wrong thing. It's easy to say that in hindsight, but what was happening is some of the provincial teams were playing a different way. I mean, probably the biggest irony of all of this is that Leinster played a very limited and prescriptive game in the Sarries European Cup final, which was against their nature, and ended up losing as a result. So I think that's a huge frustration for Leo, for Stuart, and for the whole Leinster squad, as they went away from their nature in that final. Whether they did it by choice or because Saracens exerted too much pressure, we'll never really know.
Because I remember being on the radio with you that day, and you were saying Irish rugby as a whole just needs to get over this whole box kicking thing.
Yeah,
it's a blight on Irish development, even when they're out there trying to win trophies.
Yeah, I mean, in the last Six Nations in 2019, with the highest percentage average of box kicks for any country participating. So the average kicks from our own 22 was about 29, and we averaged 15 box kicks. So over half of all our exit kicks were box kicks. Wales, for example, who won the Grand Slam, were under 25% in terms of box kicks. So there's data to back it up. It's a bit of a redundant strategy when it's used to that degree. I mean, it's a good strategy used sparingly, but I think the problem was we started to get into an issue where almost every provincial scrum half and our national scrum halves were just almost exclusively using box kicks to get out of our 22. It's a tactic that I suppose has run its course, and teams are very aware that we use it. Teams are very aware how to disarm it, and I would love to see us in the Six Nations maybe not overuse it at the very best, and avoid it might even be better.
It's interesting when we look at all this, and it's quite simple to say, well, Joe Schmidt loved his structure, and Ireland were always going to be in a straitjacket, and at times that straitjacket led to a bit of success. Then you look at the Ian Asewa comments post-World Cup, just brushing up on them this morning. Like he was speaking about the 17-18 season, mentioning that once Leinster started playing an attacking brand of rugby, and the majority of the Ireland squad was Leinster-based, they let a little bit of that Leinster flair infiltrate the camp. Joe started to go away from his tried and trusted drills and introduce a bit of what we call unstructured play that came into Ireland camp in training and in the Six Nations. They were throwing offloads, there was continuity to their play. That got them all the way to the top, and an unbeaten year, of course, with all those trophies. Post that, I hear, and this is Nasewa's words, I hear they actually went away from that and started to take it back out and went back to the conservative approach, and that's just shone through the whole World Cup and 2019. Is it as simple as that actually it was unstructured play that we were seeing in 2018, it led to the whole success, and for some reason Schmidt went back to in his view, his tried and trusted techniques?
I don't think it's that simple. I don't think it's as black and white. I think Schmidt was very, very structured, and I think what he started to do was lighten up a bit, allow players to voice an opinion, allow players to steer the direction of the overall group in 2018.
And then that didn't happen before the All Blacks game, as we now know.
I think as time developed, whether Joe felt he'd given too much control to the players, he certainly tried to wrestle it back. And
was that fair enough after what happened against Japan? Because that was, according to Rory Best and according to, I think, Schmidt himself, the Japan loss actually completely set him back in that belief that the player should be given that control the day before a game.
Yeah, it's ideally it's the type of thing you'd like think would have been resolved long ahead of how they're going to dish out responsibilities, roles and responsibilities among the group and among the management, and you'd like to think that's a consistent culture that runs for a period of time over a couple of seasons and everybody's comfortable with that. But it seemed to be very much chopping and changing and who's going to influence how we play, and that's a sure sign of panic in a group to me, and a case of the wall is kind of falling down. And it's regrettable for such a group that was so successful and talented, and for Joe, who had a hugely successful record. But the wheels started to come off, I think, pretty much from that first Six Nations England game in February. We had beaten New Zealand, we'd had an incredible 2018, but a pretty awful start to 2019, and then a 9-month period where we refused to change. Nasewa's comments, I think, are very much, they go from black over to white and back again. The answer in reality is somewhere in the middle, but there's always scope for structure and discipline and coherence among the group. Similarly, there's always opportunity for players to express themselves, and I think the best sides across any sport have a nice mix of both. Scotland at times in that second half, and we mentioned Finn Russell, had gone from one end of the spectrum to the other, had been awful and probably very overly prescribed in the first half. In the second half were all flair and brilliance, but if you leave them to do that every week, it doesn't happen. So you've got to find that balance, and I think Leinster have seemed to have got close to that balance, I think, and that's probably one of the key reasons they are successful.
Yeah, they're in that beautiful grey area that perhaps in Saba's comments didn't represent.
Yeah.
Like, is there anything more to allow us to believe that come next week and the weeks that follow, that Ireland will also exist in that grey area, except for the fact that we know that Farrell and Lancaster have worked together, and undoubtedly they're on the phone to one another chatting about rugby ideas. But is there anything we've seen in Andy Farrell's time as a coach with Ireland that would suggest that actually it is going to be this sort of new arrival for Irish rugby?
Well, no, I suppose plainly. We haven't seen them play a match under him. In terms of what he's said, the sound bites we've heard, even Sexton's first interview as captain, which was very refreshing to see him smiling throughout. To me, that was a good sign. He seemed quite relaxed, and he said that while, you know, Joe had given... Sexton argued Joe had given a certain amount of input to players, and that was acceptable to Sexton and the players at the time. He said Andy's going to take that to the next level and maybe give the players more responsibility. And I think there's great value in that. I think when you're surrounded by quality and you're surrounded by experience, it's not wise to constantly ignore it or to dampen it down and say, I know I'm all powerful and I have the ideas that will win this over. I think it's got to be a collective issue. So for Farrell to, even though they're verbal and they're sound bites, we haven't seen them play together, I think he will empower people more, and he'll allow more freedom of expression on the field for those senior players. However, results are the things that matter most. So the real test for that type of approach is, are you prepared to lose a couple of games and continue playing it? And I've often used on here the example of the Argentinian team that destroyed us, dismantled us, even though with those injuries in the 2015 World Cup quarter-final. By playing that brand of rugby, they started 18 months prior to that and lost 78-12 to South Africa in one of the first times they tried it. So it can be a gruesome transition, but it's probably worth it in the long run.
Yeah, it certainly is. The patience is certainly something that needs to be preached over the next couple of weeks, because we will actually be at the end of the next World Cup playing the same way, probably result in a similar result, and we will talk about the fact that, well, who cares about the Six Nations? It's all about the World Cup. Now that it's next week, I feel that opinion sort of changing, so we need to kind of roll back a small bit. Just in the context of the Six Nations, then we just wanted to finally get your thoughts on the Ireland depth chart, especially at half-back, and there's only one place to start. It's scrum-half. It's probably the most intriguing call of the entire Six Nations. What way are you calling this? I
would pick Cooney if I was the head coach. Murray has actually played better in recent months, a lot better than he has maybe in the previous 15, 16 months before that. But I think it's time that players who are playing on form regularly at the top of their game are given an opportunity to represent the Irish shirt. I think what happened, part of that malaise in the 10-month period of not really changing and not embracing change, even though we were under duress, was not picking people on form. I think it would be a statement selection by Farrell to say, OK, there is very little between them when they're both on top level form, but Cooney deserves a shot. And I think it shakes up what is the established order. And I think if alone that is a statement selection by Farrell, it does not mean Cooney has to start every game. You can also use Murray off the bench. You could start Murray the next week, and I often refer to Jim Gavin's selections in the All-Ireland final, where he dropped the most established Mick Fitzsimons, had 6 All-Irelands for a relatively unknown Owen Merchant, and look what he got out of that. He got 2 quality players competing for the same position and strengthened his own squad. So I think for me, I would almost unequivocally go for Cooney, just for the psychology of it and for what it represents, and a kind of a new departure with the Irish squad. And it similarly will help motivate Murray, I think, hugely as well. So its competition is to be welcomed, and that's the choice I would go for. The
form argument makes sense. We had Stephen Ferris on the show last week, and he was saying that people's form always looks better during a Rugby World Cup because they're at home, they're playing in a weekend, they're playing against weekend teams, and they have more of an opportunity to shine. But then, more importantly, afterwards, people are recovering from the World Cup, and you've got the chance to shine on a European stage, for example. Do you subscribe to that at all? That Cooney's form just needs a slight asterisk beside it, and Murray's form the same, that perhaps the World Cup hangover is an issue? No, I don't subscribe to it at all. I think form is form, and you just pick week on week
That's the entire point of picking on form. His form is right now. So, yeah, if you're suffering a bit of fatigue after the World Cup, that's tough. That's what form is. It's a professional game. So yeah, I think I wouldn't agree.
Is Conor Murray definitely Ireland's second choice scrum half then in your view? Is there a choice that is there?
He's arguably still first choice in my view. But I would still pick John Cooney because I think on form currently, if that's not a complete contradiction, you know, over the longer term, if Murray keeps playing well, there's a very compelling argument to say, you know, does he play more games in the Six Nations than Cooney? I think Farrell needs to be brave. I think he needs to shake up that Irish squad. I think Rory Best has gone. I think he's got to make important calls around CJ Stander and Peter O'Mahony. He's set out his stall with Sexton. So you're talking about 5 of the kind of key players, the crux of the team, the fulcrum. One is going to be captain. One has a question mark on selection in terms of Murray, and you've you've O'Mahony and Stander, who again would have been part of that lead players group in the last 9 months, whose form has absolutely and routinely been under what their best is, and he's got to make some big calls. And whether he is a bit hands tied behind the back in terms of back row injuries across provinces, he's not tied at 9. So I think that's his opportunity to make a big call. Yeah.
You don't see Luke McGrath then figuring if everybody stays fit. You've also obviously got Marmion and Blade who've been involved. Yeah. I guess just to remind you your depth chart then, I presume.
Those 3 names, I would say McGrath, Nex, Marmion and Caelan Blade. All 3 are quite similar players. All 3 are very, very. All 3 are probably faster in terms of just ground speed than Murray and Cooney. All 3 are quite electric around the field on their feet. They're good support runners. Caelan Blade, before had looked at his passing. I think that's improved as well. So I think we've got quite rude health at 9. I think you wouldn't be completely worried if any of them had to play in an international jersey at the moment. I think McGrath's had an unfortunate run of injuries as well. I think for me, probably Cooney and Murray are a clear front runner, and then behind that chasing 3, probably it's up to form on those 3 as well who gets in.
The out half discussion has been transformed entirely in the last couple of weeks with the news that Sexton will be fit for the Six Nations. What's your view on that depth chart? Is it a huge boost? Of course it is that Sexton is back. Like, how would we have fared without him, I guess, for an entire Six Nations without him?
Well, I think it's going to be really interesting to watch. I think Johnny could have a stellar year this year as a 10 if he stays healthy. Hopefully he does. He's now going to be in it seems to me he's going to be playing in a squad with Leinster when he does play, obviously, with Leinster. I know they wrap him in cotton wool a bit, but he's quite influential to their style. But he's not going to have any small bridges to jump over when he goes into that Ireland squad. I think there's going to be a clarity and a sense of purpose about his game that it crosses over both squads, and there won't be any to and fro in terms of philosophical. So
you mean bridges to cross, as in he perhaps wouldn't have been entirely comfortable with the style of play switching between 2 different squads?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a consistency in what he's doing, and I think if he can stay healthy, I think the captaincy it's been an interesting pick for him because we saw, for example, last year in his first season with Leinster, you know, how the Munster team really got under his skin.
It was great though.
It was brilliant. It was great TV. It was great sport, and it's good to see people lose their rag, and it freshens up the game. But I think he's got to be very wary of that, and I'm sure he will be. That teams will probably go after that. Teams will try and rile him up and niggle him. But I actually think if he can stay healthy, I think there's a huge chance for him to show the player he truly is. I think in the first couple of games after the World Cup, he was electric for Leinster. He was outstanding. Now, he picked up that knee injury, but it was as good as I've seen him in a couple of seasons. And I think whether it was the weight of the Irish environment gone, or the expectation, or the suffocating management of Schmidt, or any of the above, I think he looked like a player reborn. However, his injury profile, as we all know, is well documented. And that naturally is a frustration. But it would be great to see him get a really good, clear run this season.
Yeah, in a way, like picking your captain is almost like betting on the winning horse. Like just it's judging the momentum of a player, and I guess what you're saying there, Andy Farrell must have spotted it as well, that he's poised to have a big year if he stays fit. Making him your captain, you're kind of doubling down on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there's, you know, the longer term question is his body going to last the next 4 seasons? If it doesn't, do we have to change captain 2 years in? I think the reality is rugby is pretty abrasive and combative, and you can't necessarily plan like that, because you could set your stall out, pick a young captain. The young captain does a job for 3 years and gets injured the evening before the World Cup, and he's out for the World Cup. It's a very tricky thing to do. More likely is he'll have a younger leadership group around Sexton, I would imagine, as opposed to the older, more established heads. I'm sure he'll shake it up a little bit in that leadership group, and they'll learn from each other. So
instead of Peter O'Mahony being a key member of that leadership group, it'll be the likes of James Ryan.
Yeah, I would have thought there would at least be an elevation of younger players who haven't been in that leadership group, as opposed to maybe a demotion of the incumbents. But I'm sure they're going to start bringing in a bit of fresh blood and look for new ideas from younger guys. I think they have to.
Very briefly then, who's back up to Sexton? I presume it's Ross Byrne in your view.
I think at the moment, most likely Ross. Again, very, very understated player. Brings other players into the game really well, and which is a huge plus when you're surrounded by quality internationals. So he is understated. He doesn't quite get the praise he deserves at times, but he's quite a functional guy who brings the best out of his surrounding team players. And I think behind him, Carty's had a rough time since World Cup, but I think he's got the quality and the talent to be thereabouts. And it's been nice to see Billy Burns coming through in Ulster too.
It certainly has. I'm a lot more positive about Six Nations after chatting to you this morning, Andy. Thanks a million for that. Cheers for popping in. Deal or No Deal is next. We've got John Duggan and Phil Egan standing by. Back after these.